Are you also concerned with the current development of our democracy? And do you eventually think of a more effective, more participatory and more direct democracy? What about creating a common good democracy? Let's start with a thought experiment. Imagine the Trump administration wanted to build many new nuclear power plants, to privatize drinking water supply, and to provide top politicians with legal immunity. And that engaged citizens started a motion against these 3 law bills from the US Congress, and they collected a sufficient number of signatures to get a binding referendum on the law proposals. And then in the voting, 90% of the voters voted against these law bills and stopped them. Of course, this did not happen in the United States, but it did happen in Italy in 2011 under the presidency of Berlusconi. Italy already had its little Trump a couple of years ago. And Silvio Berlusconi did not take office because he was the wisest man of the country. Silvio Berlusconi took office because he was one of the richest billionaires of Italy, and he owned an own TV station, thanks to which he won the elections. And I think this is a major threat to equality of opportunities and democracy. To stop a law proposal of the parliament is one of the possibilities of a sovereign democracy, but there are more possibilities, and I show them here in a list of sovereign rights with which the citizens in a sovereign democracy could be endowed with by the constitution. So these would be rights of the citizenry. And the first sovereign right is to rewrite the constitution. It's not a utopia. It happened recently in Chile. A constitutional assembly was elected directly, 50% women, 50% men. The president was from the Mapuche indigenous community. And then the draft of the new constitution was not approved by the people, but this is already part of a different story. A second example is Iceland. In Iceland, a constitutional assembly of 15 men and 10 women was elected, and they drafted a new constitution which was approved by the citizenry of Iceland, but unfortunately the parliament did not encourage to sign it, because the old constitution says that the new constitution can only be adopted by the parliament. A second sovereign right is to amend the constitution. This right does exist in Uruguay, in Switzerland, and the Swiss people are quite happy with it. One consequence is the excellent railway system in Switzerland, one of the most popular in the world. A third sovereign right could be to vote for a specific government constellation and not just for one political party. Another one could be to dismiss the government if it does something really severe which the people do not like at all. Maybe to all of a sudden spend $100 billion for new armament instead of promoting peace or investment and social and ecological purposes. The fifth one is not to stop a law, but to initiate a new law. This right does not exist in Uruguay, neither in Switzerland, but in some of the Swiss cantons. Sovereign right number 6 is to initiate a citizens' assembly, which have been taking places in many countries of the world, but in no country on the initiative, on the legal right based of the citizens, although that was proposed by the first citizen assembly in Germany in 2019. Number 7 is to take control of a public good, like drinking water. There we go again, like the railway system. Look at the renationalization going on in Great Britain currently, or health or education. Number 8 is to issue money and to earn the sovereignage, which would be the successor of the seigniorage. Number 9 is to adopt an international agreement. When Austria, my country, entered the European Union in 1995, the people had to be asked, because it was a major change of the of the Constitution. It was an obligatory referendum, and the people said yes. But what if hundreds of thousands of people flooded the streets and protested against a potential new trade agreement, as it was in the case with CETA in Germany and TTIP? Then I would say that the people should have the right to decide on the adoption or not adoption of such an agreement. And the last one is the probably most tricky one. It's the final word on military missions to decide on war or peace. We will look at that in a minute more in detail. Now let's go for some general reflections. And these sovereign rights could be considered as the logical successors of royal prerogatives in monarchies, which were the exclusive rights of kings or queens in monarchies. In monarchies, the king or the queen was the sovereign instance. And the German term for royal prerogative, Regalien, stems from the Latin term rex, which means king. Geldregal does not refer to a shelf packed with banknotes, but to the right to issue money. He or she who had the Geldregal had the right to issue money. That's worth thinking about. The question now is to whom these exclusive sovereign rights were passed on in the transition from monarchy to democracy. And you may already guess the answer. It was not the people, or only exceptionally. Most of the sovereign rights were passed on to parliaments and governments. And please don't misunderstand me. This is not a case against parliaments or governments at all. It's just against conferring all the power in the democracy to these two powers. It's a case for further dividing powers in a democracy and give a bit more of the power to the people, as it's already laid out in the basic law of Germany. Waiting for implementation, especially what the votes is related to. In a sovereign democracy, the people are the highest instance, because sovereign comes from the Latin term superanus and means literally to stand above all, not to be on the bottom. That would be that one. That's today's liberal democracy. And this is the correction from a liberal democracy into a sovereign democracy. In a sovereign democracy, by means of the Constitution, which is the domain of the citizens, people can constitute their traditional powers, turning into the constitutive power, and also correct and even occasionally overrule at least the parliament and the government, not the courts. That's a different story. And these sovereign rights are, in my view, the most important missing building brick in the architecture of our democracies. On our way from monarchies, we had a focus on the development of individual fundamental rights, which in my view are one of the biggest achievements in the history of humankind. But we missed out to also think of collective fundamental rights, and they could become the bedrock or the USP of sovereign democracies. You may know these classifications of democracies and autocracies of we, them, and you may have heard that we lost 15 out of 44 liberal democracies since 28. This is the worrying tendency of the decline of democracies I was referring to. And my answer is to think of a fifth premium category, like sovereign democracies. And in sovereign or common good democracies, people have several options to initiate legal change. Here we go with an overview. To initiate a single law vote, maybe 1% of the signatures is enough. For a broader citizen assembly, maybe 3% of the electorate has to support it. even larger economic convention, 5%. And to initiate a change of the whole constitution, 10%. Icelanders, watch out and take your next opportunity. Let's now look for some practical examples of how this could be applied. I already mentioned that in the monarchy, the right to declare war was an exclusive right of the king. And in a democracy, the people should at least have a say on that decision. There are several workarounds to get that fixed. First option is what the people did in Italy in 2011. They just stopped the parliament or the government from taking a decision. This could already prevent one or another war, and at least countries from joining a war that someone else started. The second option is to dismiss the government. Maybe that's not the best option, but it's an option. The third option is my favorite option. The constitution could prohibit the government and the parliament to go to war, to declare a war without a mandate of the United Nations. And according to a scientific study, this is effective. It does matter what a constitution in a country says. And we have two lively examples that, for instance, the Japanese constitution in its Article 9 or the German basic law in Article 26 prohibit the government, the parliament, the whole country, also the citizens could not declare war a different country. And this is a great example how a sovereign democracy could amend its constitution. Imagine that the United States, the citizens started a motion to include that in the United States Constitution or in Russia. If sovereign democracies offer these powerful instruments, why not first create sovereign democracies and then use these instruments to prevent wars and secure peace? Peace is probably the biggest threat to a country and its citizens. Inequality is another huge threat, alongside with the ongoing and progressive concentration of wealth and power. In 2018, the world got its first $centibillionaire. $centibillionaire, $100,000 million as a private fortune, Jeff Bezos. Today we have more of 20 of them. And Oxfam expects the first $trillionaire by 2034. What comes after 1 trillion? Correct, 10 trillions. I'm afraid earlier than we think. This is why the Economy for the Common Good proposes, as a remedy, an upper limit to private wealth, to keep inequality within reasonable corridors and hold society together. A Dutch philosopher, Ingrid Reynolds, recently proposed 10 million euros as the upper limit, a first concrete proposal. Could also be 30 million euros. That's the threshold to ultra-high net worth individuals. With that money, you still can live a life of luxury, but you cannot buy an own TV station. The concrete thresholds, we could also call them social boundaries, could become the twin sisters of the more widely known ecological boundaries. For a socio-ecological transformation, it needs both. And the concrete thresholds could be found and investigated in a citizens' assembly. And the citizens' assembly, they have already proven to allow for innovative decision-making methods. I call it systemic consensus. And in systemic consensus, which is a proposal from two mathematicians of University of Graz, not one proposal is voted upon, but several. And then what is measured is resistance against all proposal. And that proposal that meets the least resistance is the winning proposal. I've done this exercise in more than 20 countries, more than 500 times. And what people used to propose is to limit the highest income with 5 times the minimum wage, or 10 times the minimum wage, or 20 times the minimum wage. And then they vote upon. Some even propose 300 times or 1,000 times. But these proposals are not the winners. The winning proposal usually is factor 10. or another factor close to factor 10. And there is high resistance against total equality, which we could call socialism, and there's even higher resistance against unlimited inequality, which we could deem capitalism. And the lowest case of resistance is against something that we could call a common good economy. If we compare the result with the status quo, we see how big the difference is that this innovative method of decision-making and more broadly sovereign democracies would make. The last point is overcoming GDP as a country's most important indicator of success. Criticism of GDP is as old as 1968, when one of the Kennedys, who was killed in the same year, said that GDP measures everything, in short, except that which makes life worthwhile. Our proposal is to measure only that which makes life worthwhile. If you ask the citizens nowhere in the world what they think that makes life most worthwhile, this is what they used to answer. And the recommendation of our movement is that the citizens define the goals and that the scientific community is invited to provide the indicators, thanks to which we measure the achievement of the goals. And on this example, you see how huge the potential of this innovative metric would be. And it's also an example how economic policy and security policy could reinforce one another in a common good economy and a common good democracy. And my final question to you is, would you agree that AI should take over democracy? Better not. How about the other way around? Democracy taking control of the development and applications of AI? I'd prefer that. Here comes my modest last proposal. Every human person should get a virtual digital democracy account. And on every level, from local to global, every person could be informed, be listened to, vote if there is a successful initiative going on, or initiate one of these already mentioned formats. And just the last example, the Trump administration, to end with, did justify some of its decisions with states of emergency from 1798, the Alien Enemies Act, and 1807 Resurrection Act, which are obsolete leftovers in the US Constitution. And we know the Constitution is a domain of the citizens. They could change it in a sovereign democracy. If you like it, we can just go and build sovereign democracies and step up to common good democracies. Thank you.